Scripture that I'd like to look at out of the second book of Samuel, chapter 9. 2 Samuel, chapter 9. I guess I'm one of those that really enjoys the Old Testament, just because I see so much of today in those actions, and I see how that without knowing who Christ is, without having ever experienced the ministry of Christ, how many times that you can read a passage of Scripture in the Old Testament and you can see Christ's motives and his actions and his characteristics heavily involved. And why is that important to me, and why should that be important to us today? It's because in the world that we live in today, you're not supposed to mention God anymore. You're not supposed to ever talk about Christ in public. And it's like living in a world where God doesn't exist, but yet God does exist. And when tragedy or heartaches happen, what's the first thing that people say? Well, how did God let this happen? I had a call yesterday, and a lady who was going through a hard time with her family. She says, I don't understand how come God let this happen. I says, well, first of all, he was never invited into the situation. I said, it's pretty hard to blame God for allowing something to happen whenever he was never invited in the first place. I says, but I will assure you of this, he's still present. And whenever you see characteristics of God and characteristics of Christ in the Old Testament, it just proves the fact that whenever in the book of Genesis, whenever it says, let us create man in our own image, that Christ was present at the very beginning. It just took several thousand years for him to come into the flesh so that we could see. We are benefactors of that. And in this passage of Scripture, I want you to, as you're reading this with me and as you're imagining this in your mind, I want you to think about, where do you see God in all of this? Starting with verse 1, it's just 13 verses. Then David said, is there yet anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. And they called him to David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. And the king said, is there not yet anyone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? And Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan who is crippled in both feet. So the king said to him, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, behold, he is in the house of Machir, and the son of Amiel in Lodenbar. And I probably mispronounced every one of those words, but I've got more to mispronounce. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David. I missed a verse there. Then King David sent and brought him to the house of Machir, to the son of Amiel from Lodebar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he said, here's your servant. And David said to him, do not fear, for I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall eat at my table regularly. Again he prostrated himself, and he said, what is your servant, that you should regard a dead dog like me? Then the king called Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, all that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall cultivate the land for him, and you shall bring in the produce so that your master's grandson may have food. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table regularly. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant will do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table as one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who lived in the house of Ziba were servants to Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, and he ate at the king's table regularly. Now he was lame in both feet. In this passage of Scripture, King David has become very successful as king. He has been going to battle and has been victorious. He is highly regarded in the eyes of the people. Everything that could be going his way seems to be going his way. But yet, in this passage, it also senses that he feels like something is still missing. And so he asks the question, he says, I just need to do something in case there's anybody left of Saul's family. Now, the history of this is that whenever they were at war, Saul and his son Jonathan was killed in battle. But also, all of the brothers of Jonathan were killed with the exception of one. That one escaped and later became king of Israel for about 2 years. While he was king, there was those who came in who were against him and murdered him in his own house. So everybody, it looks like, was gone. But when word came out that Saul and Jonathan were killed in battle, as were all the other brothers, so they thought, the household of Saul decided we better flee because once they clean house, they're going to clean house completely. So the nurse picked up Mephibosheth and was fleeing. He was about 5 years old, and in the fleeing process fell and probably broke both of his legs. And with the medical attention that he never received, he remained lame from that day forward. Now here he is, an adult, has a child of his own, and he is lame. David doesn't know this. And he says, is there anyone left in all of Saul's household that I could show kindness towards? Now, I want us to keep in mind that David never had anything to gain by this. By the fact that he was willing to show kindness to someone else, what else could he gain? He already had the respect of the people. He already had the following of the people. The people were in favor of everything it seemed that he did. So there was nothing for him to gain. But whenever he added Saul in, whom the people probably disregarded and didn't really have much use for, because Saul was the one who hunted for David for years trying to kill him, just because he was jealous. He was envy. He had the following of the people, and it took some of the glory away from Saul. So Saul hunted him down. David remained righteous through it all, even forgiving and forgetting about 2 different opportunities where he could have taken Saul's life, but chose not to, simply because God had anointed him as king. Far be it from him to take matters into his own hand, even though everybody else says, go ahead and do it. Go ahead and do it. You're justified in what you're doing. But David wouldn't do it. Now he makes a decision. He says, I just feel like if there's anybody left in Saul's family, I need to show kindness towards him. And I'm sure his advisors and close people probably says, that's a mistake. That's a mistake. You don't want to do this because you're honoring the guy who was trying to kill you. You're honoring a guy who really we had no use for and whom we didn't like. But David says, I feel like I've got to do something for Jonathan's sake. Jonathan was the son of Saul who was like a brother to David. They loved each other as brothers. And they were separated because of Saul's actions. So, David says, is there anyone in the family, just anyone in the family, that I can show kindness to? And so they start doing some searching. They find the servant of Saul, Ziba, and so they call him to the king, and king says, are you Ziba? And he says, yes. You the servant of Saul? Yes. He says, is there anyone left in all of Saul's family? And Ziba says, there's one. He is a grandson of Jonathan. Great news for David. But then he adds, but he's crippled in both feet. Now, it took me a while to figure out why they kept bringing that up. Do you remember back in Jesus' day, whenever they brought to Jesus a man who was blind, and the first question they asked, they says, was this man born blind because of his sins or because of his parents' sins? Remember Job? His friends, whenever they came to Job after Job had lost his family and all of his wealth and everything else, even his health, and what was the thing that they kept getting him to try and confess to? What sins have you committed? See, at that time, the people saw someone who was crippled or someone who was sick or someone who was poor as being punished by God because of their past. So whenever they asked Ziba, is there anybody in the family? Well, yeah, Jonathan's son, but he's crippled. And the mindset of the people would have been, this must be a no-good-for-nothing, low-down person because God has even punished him and has punished him all of his life since he was 5 years old. Maybe he's being punished just because he was Saul's grandson. Saul's grandson. Maybe he's been punished because he's just not a good person. So what David had to gain by being benevolent to Mephibosheth was absolutely nothing. Matter of fact, he was staking his reputation on it. But he says, I just feel like I've got to do something. If there's anybody out there, I want to do something. I just want to do something. And so here comes Mephibosheth. He knows the history of Saul. He knows the history of his dad, how much that he was despised by the people. And now that he is brought before the king whom his grandfather sought to kill time and time again. Even had armies out looking for him, searching for him, trying to kill. And you can only imagine the fear that was in his heart and in his mind whenever he came before the king, brought before the king, and he fell prostrate before him and just like, God, King, what are you going to do to me? What is it why have you called me? And I'm sure that he could see his life flashing before his eyes with every heartbeat, thinking, this is it, this is it. And David says, Mephibosheth, don't kneel before me. I've come to help you. I want to restore to you all that was your grandfather's. All that belonged to your grandfather Saul, I want to give that all back to you. I want to provide for you. I want to help you. I want you to be considered as one of my own kids, and I want you to sit at my table and eat on a regular basis. And he tells Ziba, he says, I want you to go and take all the land back that belonged to Saul, and I want you and your sons and your servants to cultivate that land and give that produce to Mephibosheth so that he might always have food to eat. But nevertheless, I want him to eat at my table on a regular basis, just like one of my own kids. Do you see anything in there that kind of reminds you of what maybe Jesus would have done? I mean, he reached out to someone he did not know, not knowing what the results was going to be. And when it come back that, well, this guy, he's kind of, as society concerns, he's kind of a tainted person. He's been crippled since he was 5 years old, and he's not gotten better, so must be something in his life. He comes from the family who tried to kill you, and here you are forgiving him with him never having done anything to deserve it. And now you're not only forgiving him, but you're restoring his fortune, and you are allowing him to be considered just like one of your own kids. Do you see Christ in that? Can't you see the characteristics of Christ, even though they did not know who Christ was? I mean, doesn't that just sound like something that almost should be in the New Testament? Now, this is the neat part. Go to the New Testament. Well, I've just got it up here. Next passage. Matthew chapter 5, verse 8. This is Jesus preaching on the Sermon of the Mount. And just one of the Beatitudes that he shares that I think it has just hit me so hard over and over the years, and that is, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Now then, depends on how you want to read that. How many here are pure in heart? Just raise your hand. Just if you know you're pure in heart, that you have absolutely nothing at all in your life that can ever be counted against you, and you're pure in heart and you're just perfect in every way, raise your hand. That's what I thought. Isn't that how you read that? You know, if I've never done anything wrong, then I'm going to see God. If I've never had a bad thought or a bad action, I'm going to see God. What does this have to do with the story that I just read? What it has to do with, in my opinion, is that when David comes to the point in his life and he says, no strings attached, I have nothing to gain. I may have something to lose, but that's okay. But I just feel like I need to do something. I don't even know who I'm doing it for. And the motives that David had was a pure motive to please God and help somebody else. I'm not doing it to gain anybody. I'm not doing it so I can get my picture in the paper. I'm not doing it so I can be on the news tonight. I'm not doing it so people say, oh, well, that David, he's just a really neat guy. He just said, I have a burden and I have a pure motive, and whatever it turns out, it turns out. Now, who saw God in this story? Picture yourself as Mephibosheth. Been lame since you were 5 years old, living in somebody else's house, and fearful of your life that somebody's going to figure out who you are, where you're at, and because of who you're related to, they're either going to disregard you, they're going to shun you, or they may try and take your life and just finish off the course. And you've been living that way long enough that you even have a child of your own. And now then you get called before the king. And instead of knowing that your life is over, you find out that because of the graciousness and because of the compassion and because of the love and because of the pure motives of the king, that you have your life restored. You have your wealth that you never have experienced since you were 5 years old restored to you. You have a reason to want to get up in the morning. You have a reason to look forward to not only to today, but to tomorrow. You get to be elevated to the status of being adopted by the king. Do you think he felt God's presence in what was going on? But was he the only one who saw God that day, during that time? No. What about David? David starts out saying, I just feel like I've got to do something. I just want to do something. I don't know what the results are going to be. Don't know if I'm going to find anybody at all. And it could be that the person I find, I don't really want to help, but I'm going to do it anyway. Maybe the person that I'm going to find is not going to be worthy of the help, but I'm going to do it anyway. Because I just feel like I need to be doing something. And here he finds the son of the person he loved like a brother, who could use some help. And he feels blessed enough to be able to say, let me help you. Let me help provide for you. Let me restore to you what should be yours, and it should have been yours from the very beginning. Let me show you graciousness. let me welcome you as one of my own. Do you think he saw God? Yeah. Now then, were they the only two? What about the people who witnessed what took place? What about Ziba and his children and his servants, who now had a new role, but they saw the motive behind it was not for political gain or personal gain or anything else, but it's just out of love and compassion? Do you think it had an effect on them? What about the people that witnessed it from the outside who had no stake in any of it? Do you think they had any insight as to the love of God in all this? I think they did. See, whenever we act on pure motives, then I believe that God is shown. And whenever we act in pure motives, I believe it's not just a one or two person deal. I believe it's how we let the light of Christ shine. Now, maybe I came to this story kind of by accident. Maybe it was divine intervention. I don't know. But the reason I came to this story and the reason I came to this message is because of all the things that are going on in our world today. I want you to think about what are some of the hardest things that you can do. Now, I'm not talking physically. I'm talking about psychologically, about emotionally, about spiritually. What are some of the hardest things that you can do? You know, sometimes whenever inflation is high, it's hard to be generous. It's possible, but it's hard. Somebody has wronged you. It's possible to forgive them. It may be very difficult, but it's still possible. You know, just to show compassion to someone who may not look like they deserve it. It's possible, but it's awful hard to do. Now I want you to think about what is the hardest thing not to do. And this is what's been really getting on to me this whole week. And I have to tell you, and I have to confess, I failed daily at different times. The hardest thing not to do is to be critical. If you don't think so, turn on the news. Just turn on anything. Walk through a group of people and not be critical. Not think twice because the person that just walked by has 4 colors of hair and not one of them's natural. Or they've got tattoos and piercings and everything else. Or maybe their clothes are not clean when everybody else's are. Or maybe they're just out there. Or, hold on, what if they're from the other political party? Ooh. And don't be critical. You know, the hardest thing to me is to not be critical. You know, I can come closer to understanding where you're coming from than I can to not be critical. But you know what? And you've all experienced this, and as I have too, sit down with someone who is critical and see how I'm feeling good about today, I'm feeling good about tomorrow, see how your outlook on life just goes right down the drain. Just see how your demeanor changes because the person that you have just visited with for the last 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 30 minutes has just been critical about everything that's going on. What does that do to you? Probably the same thing it does to me. All right, where is the light of Christ whenever that's going on? It's been turned off. It's over. It's done. because there's no light shining, because it is only darkness that is spewing forth. And it's present in every one of our lives. I confess, I hear myself and I think, I've got to change this conversation. I've got to turn this around. I was visiting with someone just yesterday, and I kept telling myself, I've got to either be quiet or I've got to turn it around. I've got to see the positive that's going on. Because even despite all the negatives that are going on, I'm just focusing on the negatives. I've got to turn this conversation around because God is still bigger than anything that we're facing. You know, a couple of years ago, just a little over a couple of years ago, whenever all this COVID started, and the recommendation was for everybody not to gather more than 10 people in a place, and then you had to be 40 foot apart. And so we closed down the church for a period of, 2.5, 3 months? You know, I remember that first week that we had decided not to have church the next Sunday. And I thought, I've got to do something. I don't know what, but I've got to do something. I can't just sit at home and everybody read a book or listen to something on TV. I've got to do something. And that's why we came up with the drive-through communion. Now, that act in itself is no big deal. You know, the little papers I passed out, of a communion devotion, no great thoughts. But it was amazing how many people came through because they still wanted a connection with God. And so what started out as just, I've got to do something, I don't know how this is going to turn out, maybe a total flop, was a way of God connecting with his people. It was nothing that I did. I just got to be a tool. That's all it was. There were how many, we turned our video system into broadcasting, the sermons, So, which I always told people whenever I says, if you want to listen to a sermon and see what everybody else has to suffer through, tune in to the YouTube channel, But there was a lot of good things come out of bad situations. But it has to be, I believe, whenever we act from a pure heart. Now then, the question is, how do we do that? One last verse, Philippians chapter 4. Probably most of you know this one by heart. If not, we should. Philippians 4, verse 8. This is the Apostle Paul, writing from prison near the end of his life, and he knew it. Not sitting in a palace someplace with somebody feeding him grapes. This is in the lowest part of his life. He writes, "Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence and if anything worthy of praise, let your mind dwell on these things." Let your mind dwell on these things. Do you ever talk to yourself? I do. I ask myself questions that I usually don't have very good answers for. But if I want an intelligent conversation, I have to talk to somebody else. But I hear myself at times. And what is challenging me is to hear myself more and then examine the motivation behind what I'm saying. Examining the attitude that's what is behind this. David just had a pure thought of, can I find anybody in Saul's family that I might show kindness towards. That's what the scripture says. Is there anyone left in all of Saul's family that I might extend to them kindness? Just kindness. If God's light shines more and shines brighter in our world, we can show the love of God, the love of Christ, in a world where you cannot talk about him, but others will be forced to see it. Think about that. We're not supposed to talk about him in public. We're not supposed to mention his name. We're not supposed to pray in public. We're supposed to act like he doesn't exist. But if we start working out of pure motives, not self-gain, because that's the world, and that's what we all battle with. But if we can start working with pure motives to extend kindness, the light of Christ will shine. Others will see it, and they will be drawn towards that light. Now, if this would take hold and grow, I believe, and maybe this is just a pie in the sky, and maybe this is just the preacher in me that is wanting to be overly optimistic, I believe that the hatred would start dissolving. I believe the need for taking out everybody you can just because you're unhappy with yourself would start to diminish. And I think the quality of life for everyone involved would go up. When Christ came to give his life on the cross so that others might have forgiveness, so that others might have life, so that others might have a second chance, was he doing it just so that we could get to heaven, or so that our quality of life would be improved? Go back to Moses. How many of the 10 Commandments deal with how we're to treat one another versus how many of how we treat God? Count them up. Is it so he can have full control over our lives? No, that so that he can be a blessing to us and we can be a blessing to others. Pure hearts is not that I have never made a mistake. It's that I don't have any ulterior motives. I just want to do something. I just want to help somebody. I just want to let God have a place in this situation, even though I don't have to understand it first. This morning, as we've gathered here for worship, I hope that you could have been able to put all the pieces of the puzzle that I've been throwing out here at you together. And I hope that I can start listening to my own conversations and try and be the bright spot instead of the wet blanket, and start allowing Christ to shine, because he's the only one that's going to get us through this life victoriously. Without him, we're nothing. But with him, all things are possible. As we stand to sing the hymn of invitation this morning, God's speaking to your heart about any decision you need to make. I pray that you surrender to God and let him have his way in your life.